In this section of Analysis Services Additional Options, we'll go through the cube processing. Processing in a project is usually just done during development. Here you have the options to deploy all or only parts or just the objects and no data of the Analysis Services database. Once data is added to the dimensional model database in the relational part, after the first deployment of your developed cube, you will need to process the cube for the new data added to the relational model or the files that are used to create the cube. This can be accomplished in a project, but it needs to be done through a scheduled job running XMLA scripts. The first object to be processed in order is the dimensions, since this has the foreign keys or relationships to fact measures. This data can be controlled as a process of either all dimensions, or it can be set to process only changed dimensions. The word change can mean new or updated objects or updated data. The fact or cube with measures is the next and last processing step in an analysis services database. New measures and or calculations need to be integrated with the new or updated dimension data. This process can be executed as all or parts of the changed data. While setting up the processing in the project, this can be scripted out and run from SQL Server Management Studio or in a job scheduler like the SQL Server agent. The script is XMLA, which is the Analysis Services Markup Language. The common job scheduler in SQL Server is the SQL Server agent. Here we can script the processing to be done on a regular or infrequent time slot with the SQL Server agent. We can create steps for the dimension that are separate from the cube and then schedule it based on a day, week, or monthly process. Processing in the project is first accessed through the properties of the project. You can right-click the Analysis Services project and go to Properties. Next, click the Deployment option on the left. Here you'll see the processing options, which include Default, Do Not Process, and Full. The Default will do the bare minimum to get objects up to date, while Full will delete all objects and rebuild the cube like it never had existed. The Do Not Process option during development allows a compile to check for errors without pushing the changes to a server instance. The Server Mode option allows Deploy All or Deploy Changes Only. The Changes Only options helps with deployment time by eliminating the need to rebuild the objects with all the data. To execute these options we just talked about, you can right-click the project and click the Deploy option. You will get a processing and it will either complete successfully or display the errors. To control the individual processing of dimension objects, there is a menu choice to process a dimension. You would only need to do this if new or changed or deleted data for that dimension has occurred in the relational database or the source files for your analysis services project. Here we have some options. The default, which only does the bare minimum to get the dimension updated. Full, which clears the object and reprocesses all data and indexes, or can be separated to just update the data in the dimension structure through the Data option. Index will rebuild just the dimension index structure for the related aggregations of the cube's measure groups. And lastly, Update, which updates the data with new changes or deleted data. Or you can actually remove the dimension from the processing, but I would not do that. The completed processing from the project will show a summary of what was done and options to see more details. The screen also provides error messages if there is a problem. So here in this picture, we see the measure groups for internet sales and reseller sales being processed. Those are those indexes for aggregations for an updated process. Then we'll see the updated product dimension where each attribute and hierarchy is processed. The second and actually last option is to process a cube. You only need to do this if new, changed, or deleted data from measure fact tables has occurred in the relational database or source files. Here we have a series of options just like the dimension. We can use the default, which does the bare minimum to get the cube updated, full, which clears the objects and reprocesses all data and objects for the measures, structure, which is if the cube is unprocessed, analysis services will process, if necessary, all the cube's dimensions. After that, analysis services will create the cube dimension. There's other option for this if it's a mining structure. The data object just updates the data in the cube. And just like the dimension processing, we will get a window to display the progress and completion of the processing of the cube. Here we can see that the fact internet sales has 3 different partitions: 2013, current, and pre-2013. If we wanted, we could script it where only the partition with current data would be processed. So let's look at a demonstration of processing a cube. First, we'll launch the SQL Server Data Tools through an icon on our desktop or through the Start menu. Next, we'll open up a previously created project for our Analysis Services database. This is a multidimensional cube which is different than the Tabular module. First thing we'll do is right-click on the AdventureWorks DW 2014 project and go to Properties. We'll go to the Deployment option on the left and we can see our processing options: the default, do not process, and full. The next part we'll look is the server mode, which has deploy all or deploy changes only. When developing, the deploy changes only helps with the speed of the deployment of the cube, where it only looks for changes since last made. But what it doesn't see is if the data has been updated. So if the data has been updated, you will need to go to the dimension if you have deploy changes only. I'm going to click OK and right-click the project and hit deploy. Here we'll see a progress in our lower right window, and it's actually deploying the whole cube. Once it's done, we get a message that the deployment has been completed successfully. If there's an error, we can drill into the part where the error is and actually look at the details of what was done. Here we can actually copy this selection to paste it in some other environment. Next, we're going to look at processing cubes and dimensions individually. So if we just deployed the structure of the cube, but not the data, and some product data has been updated, I can right-click Product and click Process. I have the options under Process Options of the default, which does the bare minimum based on what it sees is updated with the product dimension. Full, which will process all the data and all its aggregation indexes on the measure groups. And then if we do something like clear, then it's going to be empty and we'll have to do data and index. Or we can select update, which will just process updated data. The process update will take some time because it's got to compare the existing data to a previous data. So sometimes the full option is just better. I'll click the Run option and we'll see the progress go through. We'll see the measure groups as well as the dimensions. If we wanted to view more details, we could click the View Detail button if more data appears that can't be displayed on the initial window. I'm going to close this and then go to the AdventureWorks cube and do the process just like we did a dimension. Here we can process full, data, structure, clear, index, or just process add. We'll do a full and click Run and we'll see the progress of the individual measure groups being processed. Here we could drill in and see the individual partitions for one of the measure groups. If any errors appear, we can drill down to the error, click the View Details, and see more details about that error. Now, in the additional options of analysis services, we're going to look at the scripting language of XMLA. To get help with scripting the processing in XMLA, you need to use the SQL Server Management Studio. Here, you can see the script that the database, the dimension, or cube is able to be processed or created through a menu choice called Process. Once you have the processing option selected, which you see in the drop-down under Process Options, here we have Process Full. You can click in the upper part of the window the Script button. This will enable a new query window to have a script from SQL Server Management Studios. There's additional options to script to your clipboard or to script to a file. Once it's scripted, you see the processing options. These are located in that XMLA script under the type in the XML script. Here, you can change this based on the options that you saw in the drop-down, whatever is needed for the individual dimension or cube. Your processing is done by individual table as well as the dimension and fact table. The example on the right and below shows the options of Process Full, additionally with Process Update, which are more typical than the other options. The Process Update updates new, updated, and deleted data, whereas Process Full will process the entire table. After having the correct script, you can now create a job in the SQL Server agent to schedule the processing. To create a new job, you have to open SQL Server Management Studio, and then you'll need to connect to the database instance. This is where SQL Server Agent is located. Once you get to the SQL Server Agent folder in the Management Studio Object Explorer, you can right-click the job folder under SQL Server Agent and select New Job. Next, you're going to give the job a name and then go to the Step menu on the left tree. Here, you can add a new step, and multiple steps can be added here. You give the step a name like Process Product Dimension, Process Date Dimension, or Process Cube. The type has to be SQL Server Analysis Services command, and in the Run As drop-down, you see SQL Server Agent Service account. This means that you have to have that account with permissions to access the database as well as process anything on the Analysis Services Cube side. You can edit the available Run As in the SQL Server Agent, but that is a different topic. Here, the type has to be SQL Server Analysis Services command, and you specify a server. The server in our case is dot, which means local host. The script can then be pasted in the command window. The next thing you want to do is add a schedule for this job to be run. Here, our new job schedule is going to be called nightly, and the type is recurring. There's a checkbox to enable or disable the job schedule. Once we have selected recurring, we'll see a frequency of daily, weekly, or monthly. Here we chose daily and selected it recurs every 1 day. Finally, we give it 11 p.m. as the time to run. Now we'll look at the processing of a cube, including the dimensions separate from the cube itself, and also how to schedule this in a job to be run periodically. First thing we'll do is launch SQL Server Management Studio. Once Management Studio is launched, then we'll need to connect to our Analysis Services instance. We'll change the type, specify the server, and connect. We'll drill into databases and go to our VentureWorks database. The first thing we'll look at is dimensions. We'll right-click on Date and go to Process. The date dimension usually is not updated very frequently, so you can actually process it here by clicking OK if you'd like. It'll give you the progress of the processing of the dimension along with the details of the attributes. If we close this and go back and right-click Date and go to Process, we'll notice that process update is the option. You could do a full process on this dimension, and then you will get the measure groups related to it as well as the dimension itself. You can also script these individually out as a clear, data, and index to get the same effect as full. This will help clear everything out individually to see what takes the longest. Here, we'll just use the update, and we're going to click on the script button. Before we click on the script button, you'll see that there's 3 different options here. You can script to a new query window, a file, or the clipboard. Clipboard lets you paste it in some sort of other text editor. We'll just say script to new query window, and we'll get the script for our date. I'm going to click cancel, and if we wanted to, we could actually just run it straight from here if we'd like. We're not going to do that. We're going to go back to the Object Explorer, right click on product, and process the product. Instead of doing an update on product, we're going to say full and script that one out. Same effect as we saw with date. And lastly, we're going to look at the cube. We're going to right click the cube, click on process, and here we're able to tell it how we want to process the cube. You could do the clear structure data, which is the same sequence that full would be doing. If there's no structure changes, then there's no need to process the structure, which is also like process full. So here we could pick process date, or we could say process default, which will look at the bare minimum amount that needs to be done to process a cube. That includes the changes to the structure as well as the data itself. Now, once you get this running over time as new and new data gets entered into the database, you're going to want to do a full periodically, say once a month, or even maybe once a week, maybe on the weekend when no one is using it. But a daily one, you want to just use the default. So we'll script this out, and now we have 3 scripts. I'm going to copy this script by selecting all, and now we're going to create an actual job to run it. We'll connect to the data engine and go to the SQL Server agent and right-click job and create a new job. Here we're going to process the dimension and cube. It's good to process the dimension first in case new dimensions are added to relate to the cube data. So our steps, we're going to create the first new step, which is actually process dimension. But since I copied the cube, I'm just going to go ahead and say process cube, and I'm going to show you how we can move the order of the steps around. The type has to be SQL Server Analysis Services Command, and the SQL Server Agent service account needs to have access to the database as well as being able to deploy a cube. The server is our local instance, and we'll paste this information here. If we click on Advanced, we'll see that we can actually output the file of the execution for review like a log file. You can even tell it to append the output to an existing file so you have a running record of what happened each day. It's a good debugging tool to use rather than just using the job information. I'm going to click OK and create a new one, and we're going to say process product dimension. Again, we have to pick the SQL Server Analysis Services command and give it the server name. I'll go back to my query windows and go find the processing for the dimension. I'm going to copy that and paste that into my command and click OK. Here I can actually move that one up to the first step. Down on the bottom right, it tells you what step to start at. I'm going to go back to step 1. Lastly, we'll look at processing the date dimension. We'll change this to SQL Server command. It's the SQL Server server agent that it's going to run, and it's our local instance. I'll go grab that text again and paste it inside of here and click OK. And again, I want to get the date dimension and move it up 2 steps and then say this thing is going to start at step 1. In the job itself, you could tell it what to do on success or on failure. And here, you might want to go on failure to go to the next one or not. It's up to you, but usually you want it to fail initially and send you an email. There's an alert system and also a notification system where you can tell it to email somebody if the job fails. Or you can even email if it succeeds or completes. I usually put the complete and then be able to get an email so I could see what completed and how long it took. And then I could review later if there were any failures. Last thing we're going to do is create a schedule. We're going to go to the Schedule tab on the tree in your left side and click New. Here we're going to say Nightly Cube Processing. And it's recurring, which means it doesn't occur once or when a particular thing starts up or CPU becomes idle. It's enabled, so the job will run, and since it's recurring, the time occurrence is not available. If you were to pick one time, then the one-time occurrence is available. But since we're recurring, we're going to tell it to recur daily. If we wanted to, we could say weekly and say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and have a separate procedure for Saturday and Sunday. We might still say Sunday night in case new data comes in over the weekend. Next, we specify a time, like 11 p.m. And now that's going to run. The bottom part for the duration says we're going to start the schedule on 12/9, and there's no end date, or there is an end date. We might only want to create it for a certain amount of times or certain occurrences for that particular schedule. We'll click OK and then OK again. And if we go to the Object Explorer, to our Job Activity Monitor, we will see that that job now has been scheduled for tonight at 11 p.m. We can right-click and start the job now, and it'll actually ask us which step to start on. We're going to start on 1, and it should succeed through all 3 of these steps. Now the job is scheduled to be processed after the data has been entered. If we right-click on the job and go to View History, we can actually drill in and see the comments and text associated with each step, which the first one was date, then product, then the cube itself. If we were to have an error, we could actually look at the error here as well. If we view history and drill down, we can see what the error message might be inside of the job. So let's talk about the multidimensional cube storage. To access the cube storage options, you will have to go to the properties of the cube, which means you have to open the project up in SQL Server Data Tools. Once you get into the cube, you highlight the top measure, which in our case is AdventureWorks DW 2014, and go to the Properties window. If you scroll to the bottom, you'll see Storage, Proactive Caching, and Storage Mode. By clicking the ellipse next to the Proactive Caching, you'll bring up a window with a slider. You can see that by default, MOLAP to the far right has been selected, and it gives you a description that the measure group data and aggregations are stored in the multidimensional format. Notifications are not received when data changes, and processing must be scheduled or performed manually. MOLAP is the default, and all data is aggregated or pre-aggregated into the cube database. No access during reporting is needed to the source data, only during the processing. ROLAP is an option that does not pre-aggregate data in the cube database. Access while reporting is through queries to the source system. HOLAP is a hybrid of using ROLAP and MOLAP and tries to determine the best optimal way to store data in pre-aggregated form into the database. There are combinations of these options, and they mention very different paths, and really the paths are picked based on the structure of the cube and the underlying data. You can see we have 4 options for MOLAP, and actually 1 for HOLAP and 1 for ROLAP. ROLAP and HOLAP, of course, is more real-time database data access. Lastly, in the storage mode, you'll see an option for in-memory. This, Microsoft says, is just for the SharePoint integration, a power pivot of the Analysis Services installation. So if you pick the third option while installing Analysis Services, this is where in-memory is used. There are warnings when using ROLAP and HOLAP. When using these, you need to be aware of the performance issues when reporting from the cube. Remember, queries are run directly on the source system with ROLAP and HOLAP, whereas multidimensional is combined into the cube. It queries the source database And this might not be optimal, and you might have to put on your DBA hat and start indexing your source system. The data is not pre-aggregated like MOLAP. You will definitely see a performance difference with MOLAP being significantly faster. Unless you have a powerful server and well-designed model for the source, it's usually best to use MOLAP. If you want to use ROLAP or HOLAP, what's nice about it, even though it's a slower response, whereas MOLAP is a slower response on processing, ROLAP and HOLAP is enabled real-time analysis of your source data. So when new data goes in and the user reports against it, it will be spit out to them. But MOLAP will just be the processing last done, which is usually scheduled nightly for a cube, unless some other method is selected. The best thing to do is weigh your options and inform your users. They have to make a determination as if reporting is more important or processing should be faster. Now let's look at a demonstration in the additional options of analysis services about cube storage. This relates particularly to the multidimensional cube. We'll launch SQL Server Data Tools. Once this is launched, we're going to open up our previously created project. Once our project is opened up, we're going to go to the cube itself and then take a look at the properties of the cube. Here we'll click on the top level of the measure groups and scroll down in the properties. In the lower right under storage, you'll see proactive caching. We'll click on the ellipse and we'll notice the different options. Here, as you move the slider across, you'll see changes in the middle of the screen of how this stuff is processed. Full MOLAP means you have to do the processing yourself on a scheduled basis or manually, whereas scheduled means internally it's going to automatically perform every 24 hours. The automatic is going to do it when there's no restriction on latency. The medium latency processes automatically and listens for notifications for data changes. Again, these are all options for the MOLAP: low latency, medium latency, automatic, and scheduled. MOLAP is always going to compile all the cube data within the cube itself. It will not have to access the source or relational database tied to the dimension and fact tables. The next option is real-time HOLAP. This uses a hybrid of ROLAP relational and MOLAP multidimensional. It'll actually determine what's best to store in as aggregates but leave the detail or grain level inside of the source data. If I were to highlight HOLAP and click OK, if you notice in the lower right, the storage method has changed to HOLAP. And if I go change this to the ROLAP option, which means get all data from the relational engine, then it'll change there as well. Again, a warning that if you use ROLAP or HOLAP, the return of data in your reporting modules will be slower than if it was in the MOLAP form. The MOLAP can pre-aggregate and index on the aggregations, but the processing takes longer. In order to determine what's the best OLAP to use, you're going to have to discuss this with your business and decide with them what the best option is. If I go back to MOLAP and click OK, I'll also notice under the storage options there's an in-memory. If I choose this in-memory, right-click and deploy, I should get an error. The reason we're getting the error is that in-memory is only for when you install analysis services with PowerPivot compiled into SharePoint. It is not an option for the multidimensional cube. I'll close this, go back to Properties to my lowest level, and change that back to MOLAP. And also I have to go back to my proactive caching to keep that as MOLAP. So here as we discuss the different caching options as well as the storage mode. One last thing to know is that under custom settings you can actually change individual settings for all these as well. You can even enable proactive caching and schedule when the update of the cache happens or when you want to drop the cache. You You can actually update the cache periodically based on a schedule, and you have other options that you can set. There's notifications as well for when you want to schedule some of these options. We'll change all that and actually click cancel and keep the MOLAP as our cube. Remember, MOLAP, the processing is longer, whereas ROLAP, the return of the data to reporting tools, is slower.